go over what we did go over. So we went over, well, we started with going over arrays, or no, we started with template strings, right? We talked about how we can include HTML in our JavaScript. Then we went over arrays and array methods. We talked about how to create arrays, different kind of arrays, different ways of doing it, how we can put different types of data types inside our arrays. Then we looked at some array methods and properties, how to get the values using the index numbers, how to get the index numbers using the values, how to add stuff. So we talked about unshift and unshift, that basically adds and removes items from your array from the front. Push and pop adds and removes items towards the end. We talked about the reverse method. We're going to be using this a lot. We talked about sorting. We talked about sorting numbers and how it only does it using the first digit, so we use these compare functions to actually sort them properly, right? Yes. Then we talked about object literals. We talked about arrays made of objects. Let me bring this down a little bit. We talked about date and time, how to get date and time, specifically hours, days, months, years, blah, blah, blah. We talked about comparison operators, logical operators. Then we went into if statements, and then we saw how those logical and comparison operators work. You guys learned the if-else statements, also the else-if, right? You guys remember that? Yes. We went over switches, which is just basically another way of doing an if statement, but it's useful when you have lots of cases. So in this case where we have 7 cases, instead of doing if, case equals 0, and then else if, else if, else if, else if, else if. Instead of doing that, we just basically created a case structure, which basically, displayed our day for the day, okay? So now we're going to be moving on to functions. We're going to be talking about what they are. So let's actually create a file in here. We'll call this 14 functions.js. Then I'm going to come down in my index, and I'm going to add a script file for the JavaScript file we just created. And we called it 14 functions. Save. Let me open live server. Open up my console just so we have that. What's wrong with this? And I'm going to come back over here and just do an alert just to make sure that everything's working. And yes, it is. Okay. Close that door. All right, guys, so what are functions?
Predefined methods. Sorry. It's just basically telling to do something.
So it's basically blocks of code that executes a task either later or right away. Okay? So let's do functions. Okay, they're one of the most important control structures. So it's a control structure. If anybody were to ask you specifically, what it is, you would define it as a control structure, which basically exists in every programming language. Okay, and we said that it's blocks of code that can be defined, then called at a later time, or actually in some cases defined and called at the same time. Okay. Now, as we saw in our examples, functions take in parameters, which can later be passed as arguments when the function is called. And if you don't know what that means, we're going to go over it, you'll see. Okay, so let's first talk about function declarations. Okay, so we'll just create one. Let's create a function called greet. Call this greet1. Okay, and then I'm going to open parentheses. Now our parameters are going to go in here, but I'm not going to add any yet, so we'll just come down. This is going to be a very simple function. Okay, now in between these brackets, whatever goes in here stays inside the function scope. Okay, so if I create a variable over here, it's not going to affect anything outside of this function. Okay, so if I just do a simple console.log hello, well, what's going to happen? Hanuman, what's going to happen?
It's gonna print hello.
Okay, you're saying it's going to print hello. What is it going to do, Hanuman?
I think we should call the function first before printing it.
I think you're right. Let's save it. It doesn't do anything because all we did at this point is that we just declared the function. In order for you to call the function, you basically do the function name and then parentheses, and that's it. So now what this does is it's actually calling the function. It's going to print hello for us. Let me make this a little bit bigger.
So you're just calling by the name, that's it?
That's it. Yeah, that's it. So if we had like parameters over here, then our arguments would go inside here when we're calling the function. Okay? Let me actually make a note in here as well. Anything inside here is a function scope. Let's also look at something called the return keyword. Now this is something we won't do often, but or actually unless for the purpose of console logging, usually we return the function. So we can do the same thing. Function, let's do greet2 this time, no parameters. Open this. This time instead of console logging, we can just do return hello, and it'll do the same thing. So greet2. Actually, let's put in something different over here. Hello, return keyword. Okay, so now if I save, am I returning it? Oh, that's because I gotta do a console. So I just do a console.log over here, and then I put greet2 inside. Okay.
We don't have to call that function.
So this actually we don't need. Okay. So it's just basically using the return keyword, but it's kind of like flipped. See what I'm saying? Like over here, we were already console logging it. Like this function already knows that it needs to be consoled. But in this over here, it doesn't. So we can actually even alert this and see if it comes up. So let's do alert greet2, and let's see if that works. Yeah, see that?
Yeah.
Because this function is already saying, hey, no matter what happens, just return this. And then we can use basically our methods to basically tell it in what form we want it to be returned. As opposed to over here where we just basically consoled it. So every time we run it, it's just going to console it. Okay? All right. And actually the return keyword, this part over here, this will fall under the function declaration section. So this is like a subsection of it, just so you're mapping it correctly in your mind. Okay? Moving on, let's talk about parameters and arguments. All right. So a parameter simply put is a variable, or it looks like a variable in a method definition. or just a method, or basically just a variable in a function. Just put it that way so you're not confused. And then arguments is the data you pass into the method's parameters. So let me show you what that means. Let's create another function. We'll call this greet3. And then in here, we'll add two parameters. Okay? So we'll add a first name, comma, and we'll add another one called last name. Okay? Now what I want to do is I want to return hello, first name, plus last name. So now if I console.log and just do greet3 by itself, so notice what's happening over here is that at this point right now is just basically returning us hello, undefined, undefined, right? Because over here we got the hello, then we got the first name and the last name, and so far these are, remember I said they're basically these parameters, they're basically like variables inside functions. So you can say we've initialized them, right? Just like let val, except it doesn't have a value, so it's undefined. So then what I can do is that if I actually want to use my arguments, what I'll do is that I'll do console.log greet3, and then inside here I can add my parameters. So the first one we can say is John, and then the second parameter can be Smith. Okay, so if I save now, you'll see it'll spit out hello John Smith. Okay, so again, these right here, they're parameters. Okay, and these are arguments. Okay, these are basically what you add when you're calling the function, just so we can get a proper return. Okay, as it was intended. Now before ES6, we would have to do an if statement to replace each parameter to a default value because the arguments weren't passed, right? So in this case, when we just console logged, it just basically gave us hello undefined, undefined. But realistically, when you're working on a website, and let's say that you have a function where you want the user to enter some information and it doesn't, you don't want it spitting out undefined, undefined, because that just looks crappy, right? Yeah. So what you want is that you want basically like a placeholder in there, just to kind of sit in there until the user puts in their own values, right? So I'm going to show you the old way of doing that and how we used to do it. Okay, so for, let's say, default values, and we'll say pre-ES6. So this was before the way it was done. And I'm showing this to you because you're going to see some people doing it. And so you're not confused. So we'll just call this greet4, and we'll give this a first name, last name, okay. And then we're going to do an if statement. So we'll say, because we know that this parameter right now, if we just console logged it straight up, it would return undefined, right?
Yes.
So what we want to do is that we're going to say if the type of first name equals undefined, then the first name will equal John. Let me close this so you see the full line. Okay. Then for the last name, we do the same thing. So I'll just copy and paste it and just change this to last name. And then last name equals Smith. Okay, so let me comment that out and let's do this. So now what we want to do is after we're done, let's do return. Copy paste this. Okay, so inside this function, we've got our if statements. That's basically saying that if the type of first name is undefined, if for some reason it's undefined, then basically change the first name to John as a default. Okay? Same thing over here with the last name, and then we're doing a return to basically return the statement or the expression hello, first name, last name. Okay. So now, if I console.log greet4, you will see that because I didn't pass in any arguments, it's just going to basically spit out the default John Smith. So if I save, ooh, it says John is not defined. Oh, it's because I got to put that in quotes. Oops. It's a string, not a variable. Yep. So it spits out hello John Smith. But if I run the same function with my arguments, so first name will say Morta, last name Bhai. And if I save it, hello Morta Bhai.
Nice.
Yeah, so that's basically how you do your defaults. Now, in the newer version, it's much, much easy. So this is, we'll say default values, we'll say ES6. Function, we'll call this, I guess, greet5, since we're already going in that order. And then here what we do is that when we create our parameter, we'll just include the default right here. So first name John equals, or first name equals John. Second parameter, last name equals Smith. So now our default is already there. And then again, return hello, first name, last name. Okay, so now if I console greet5, you'll see it spits out John Smith. Okay? And likewise, if we add in our arguments, so again, this time we'll say Patla Bhai. Save. Hello, Patla Bhai. Everyone good so far? All right, let's now talk about function expressions. So basically what a function expression is that it is putting a function in a variable, basically, is all that it is. It can be named or anonymous. We'll talk about what that means. And usually they are anonymous. So basically, if we ever have a function that's anonymous, it's usually going to have a named variable. And it'll be an anonymous function, but you could name it if you wanted to, but you don't. So let's actually see one. So we'll call one called square. And we'll say const square. And it's a function that's going to take in a parameter called x. Okay? And we're going to return x times x. Okay? So now if I console.log, instead of the name of the function, we'll just call the name of the variable. So we'll do square. And then in here, let's put 8. What's that going to give me?
Return 64.
Yep, 64. Okay. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that in most cases, using a function declaration compared to a function expression really won't make much of a difference, but there are times when function expressions have some benefits to them, when it comes to hoisting and closures, and those are like more advanced topics that hopefully we'll get to. Um, but they basically both work the same way. The only difference is that in here, this function, we don't have to give it a name, but we can actually store it in a variable, and then it gets called like this. Okay? Now, there are these things called ifs. Have you guys ever heard of ifs? They exist in other programming languages too. Okay? And it stands for immediately invocable function expressions. Every single job interview that I've went to, they've always asked me to explain what an IFI is. Okay? Which is why I'm compelled to kind of go over this. Because I don't want you guys to be put in a situation where, you know, they ask you something and you don't know. So these basically work just like regular functions. They take in parameters. Basically, it's a function that you declare and you run at the same time. So to do this, we need it to be an expression, and we can do that by putting the function inside the parentheses. So let me actually show you how it works. My mouse is lost. Where's my mouse? Okay. So we're going to start by creating parentheses, and then we're going to put a function inside it. We'll create another pair of parentheses that basically is a syntax for our function, and then open up curly braces and then come down. Okay, and then we're going to do console.log, and in here let's put if he ran. Okay, so now if I save this, it doesn't do anything. Oh, that's because I didn't call it over here. So we call it again one more time, and then we just put a semicolon to basically end the expression. Okay, so you have the function that you would write normally. It goes inside the parentheses, and then a parentheses right after it to basically call it.
Oh, wow.
So now it'll run.
So we don't have to give a name for this function, right?
Huh? It can be anonymous. It doesn't have to have a name.
Why do we have to write in this way?
Because if you want to run it and call it at the same time, then that's what you would do.
Oh.
Yeah. So let's do it again.
Okay.
So I'm gonna create a pair of parentheses. This is where our function is gonna go, and then I'm gonna create another pair. This is where it's gonna be called. Okay. So let's start by creating the function. Let's do one called function, and then we'll give it a parameter called name. Okay. Open up my parentheses, and then we'll do console.log. Let's do hello plus name. And then in this parentheses, the one that we created, the second one, the one that calls it, I'm going to put a parameter in here, and then we'll say my name is going to be iffy with param. So if I save it now, it'll run it and it'll say hello iffy with param. Should have put a space over here. Yeah. Okay. And these are immediately invocable function expressions. I know it's a mouthful. That's why they just call them ifs for short. Everybody good so far? Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like when you want it to be called right away, you know, it'd be one of those situations.
You want it? I said it if you want it. Because we're not going to have it anyway.
All right. Now we've already covered this, but since this is a part of functions, you guys do know what property methods are, right?
No.
Guys, come on.
No, we don't know.
Again, we already covered it, but
Property methods. I don't remember.
guys, we just went over all sorts of methods when we were going over objects and arrays and how to manipulate them.
Those methods, okay. Those are called property methods?
Methods or property methods, but the word methods should give it away.
Right,
okay?
Okay.
What is a method?
Okay.
What is it? I'm asking you. It's not okay. What's a method? It's a pre-built function that's already been made for you that comes built in JavaScript. Okay, like stuff like reverse, stuff like splice, push,
Math.
pop,
Math function.
math functions. Those are all methods that JavaScript has already built for you. Okay,
Yeah.
so yeah, functions inside objects. Yeah, so let's do const. Let's create a variable. We'll call it to do, and we'll create an object. We have a key of add, and then we'll create a function in here, and then we'll just say console.log add to do. Okay, so this is my first key pair value. My key is add, and then function is my value, which is actually my method. Now I'm going to separate this by a comma, come down to the next line. My next is going to be edit. I'm just making this up as I go. So let's create another method. We'll give it a parameter of ID, and then I'll console.log. Let's do template strings. I'll do backticks, and we'll do edit to do $, curly braces, and then my parameter, which is ID. Put a semicolon over here to follow the syntax. Okay, I'm going to save it. It's not doing anything yet. Why? Because we haven't called it yet.
Yes.
So we'll do to-do.add. Again, we're doing add because this is now a method. And then if I save, it'll say add to do. See, it spits it out for me. Okay? Okay, and you have to put the parentheses around it because this is a method now.
Right.
Okay? Same thing with edit. Okay? So we can do to-do.edit. And then obviously this takes in a parameter. If we do it without a parameter, it'll just say edit to do undefined. But do you remember we can also do a default too? So we can just do this and then put in a value, and then we can say default ID. Just for now, it can be anything, but edit to do default ID. But if I pass in a parameter over here, let's say we want it to be a number, ideally, because an ID is usually a number.
Right.
So if I do that, it'll say edit to do 22. Okay?
Yeah.
We've already gone over this, but just not in the same context as functions.
Right.
But we've done this before. So hopefully now like two different pieces of the puzzle are maybe coming together and connecting. I hope.
Yes.
I hope. Okay? And guys, this is basically all there is to know about functions. You good? Okay, yeah, look at it. Please, don't let me rush you because, yeah, we have enough time to finish this today. We've got, we're going to go over loops. We're going to talk about scope in a little more detail and the window object, and then after that we're going to start working on the interview questions, and then we're going to spend the rest of the day just basically solving interview questions.
Nice.
Okay?
Yes.
And then when we come back next week, we're going to start DOM manipulation. Hopefully that should be 2 more weeks, and after that you guys are ready. If you guys want to come back, I'd be more than willing to host like a couple more sessions and go over some more advanced JavaScript features. If you guys want, I don't care if it's 1 or 2 or 30 people. If you want me to come in, I'll come in, we'll do it. We'll do it. Okay, but honestly, after learning the fundamentals and after learning DOM manipulation, you are ready to start working on your projects as a front-end developer. Okay?
Yeah.
Cool. So, let me know whenever you guys are ready.
We are.
Okay. So that was functions. Now let's create a new file for loops. So this was 14, we'll say 15, loops.js. Come back over here. Comment out the script, create a new one. My source in here is going to be 15, right? Loops. Okay, yeah. Save. Alert. Yeah. Okay. So I want you guys to open up some multi-comments at the top. We're going to be taking a lot of notes over here. Now we're going to talk about general loops and iteration.
For loops.
For loops. Do you guys know what iteration means?
Yes, repeating.
It's just basically repeating. So like if I have a circle, right, technically it's a loop, but if I have an object that's going around it, every time it makes a full circle, that's one iteration. And then a second iteration. And then a third iteration. Right? Okay, so that's what iteration is. So let's talk about loops. And basically, what are they? It's an instruction. Let me turn off my caps lock. It's an instruction that repeats until a specific condition is reached or met. Okay, it's used to run the same block of code using different values each time. Now, there are multiple ways to run iterations in JavaScript, but the most popular ones, or the more popular types of general loops, and these are used in pretty much all programming languages, and you've seen these before. So number one, we have for loops. Okay, then we have while loops. Thank you. And then we have do while loops. Yeah. Yeah, do you feel like you're back in college eating ramen noodles?
How do you know that?
Because we all did it, that's why.
I used to have this vending machine and I used to, oh god.
In India?
Nah, Papa, Australia. India में vending machine रहती है.
That's
Okay, so for loops, let's just take some notes over here. What makes it different than the other one? So this one over here, I would say, let's see, what does it do? It takes in 3 parameters, or it can take in up to 3 parameters, and they're all separated, obviously, by semicolons. And you'll see all this in action. It's going to make sense. So the first parameter, it's basically the declaration of the variable. That's the best way I would put it. Second parameter is the condition. And the third one is the increment. Okay? So remember we talked about I plus plus is the same as I equals I plus 1? Yeah. All right. So let's do for loops. Okay. All right. So here's a simple for loop. So I'm going to do for, open parentheses. Now remember, our first parameter is the declaration of the variable. So whenever we're doing for loops, you can call your variables whatever you want, but in JavaScript, the best practice is to just use the I variable because it's just short for iteration, so that whenever you see like an I variable somewhere, you'll assume, most likely you'll know that if it's a good developer who wrote that code, is that they're talking about some iteration for a loop somewhere. Okay, so that's basically what that's for. So we're going to do let I equals 0, because that's our starting point. And then we'll say as long as I is less than 10, I want it to increment by 1. Okay? So in here, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do console.log and simply just I. Okay? So now when I run this, you'll see that it'll start at 0, and then it'll iterate through every single number until I is less than 10. Okay, now if it was less than or equal to, then it would just go up to 10, right? but I'm just going to leave it less than. Just so you can see why the 10 isn't coming. Because it's not less than or equal to. So we'll just leave it at that.
Starts with 0, right?
Yeah. Then what we can also do with for loops, and then I'll just make a big comment, other things we can do. No. Let's first go over concat. And let's put in a string over here. We'll say number plus I. So now it's just number, actually let's put a space over here so it looks a little cleaner. We got number 0 all the way through 9, okay? And again, this isn't anything like very major that we did. We just basically concatted a string with whatever our iteration is going to be, and it's going to repeat each time. Okay? Now what we can do also, let's say that I want to skip a number, right? It's going through all the iterations, but I really don't like the number 5. So let's do the same thing. I'm going to copy, well, I already copied it, so let's do skip an iteration. Or another way of saying it, break out of loop. Okay? So I'm going to paste that in here. And I'm going to say if, we'll say if I equals or triple equals 5, we'll say console.log let's do backticks, and then I'll say dollar curly braces, say I, oops, is my favorite number. I think I'll just stick to favorite. There you go, now I printed it.
But it's not removing the number 5.
Yeah, you noticed that, huh? So basically what's happening over here is that it's hitting the if statement, and it consoles the 2 message. So it basically consoles the 5 message.
Right.
So 5 is my favorite number, but it's still printing this. So basically what it's doing is that it's hitting all of them,
When it's coming
but then
to
it's also
5.
saying is that when it comes to 5, print this out. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to replace it with the 5th iteration, right? That's what we want. I think if I just do continue, that'll do it. Yeah, it skipped it.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so that's what it was. Okay, now let's say that we actually want to break out of it after 8. Okay, so if we want to break out of it after 8, what we can do is that we can do f I triple equals, let's say 8. Then we'll do a console, and we'll say break out of loop, and then we'll just say break. Now what's going to happen is that it'll just break out of loop. So here, let me make a comment over here. Break out of loop, and in here, skip iteration. Okay, well we can also do this part over here where it says, you know, like 5 is my favorite number. If I just comment that out, then it'll just skip the whole thing altogether. Because it's just saying, hey, once you get to 5, just, you know, skip it. Basically, that's what continue says. Okay, and again, this is a property, not a method. You know how I know that? Because it doesn't have parentheses after it, so it's not being called.
Yes.
Okay? Same thing with break, it's a property. Yeah, two things that can be very confusing to like differentiate from. Parameters versus arguments, and properties versus methods.
Parameter versus arguments, properties versus methods.
Yeah.
Okay.
Noman, what's the difference between properties and, or actually arguments and parameters? We just talked about it in functions.
Arguments
So,
are sent.
yeah, so like when we declare a function, whatever values we want to set that we want to manipulate, these are called parameters. Okay? And then to actually manipulate these parameters, once we're calling the function, we enter them as arguments.
Okay.
When you actually call them. So right now we created this function. We're saying, hey, this function is going to have a first name and it's going to have a last name. Now what this function is going to do is that it's going to return a statement. It's going to say hello, whatever your first name or last name is. Okay.
So those are first parameters.
These are parameters.
Okay.
Okay. Now once we actually run the function and we want it to display a certain first name or certain last name, in our case we chose John and Smith. These are the arguments.
When you're calling, it's an argument. When you're defining, it's a parameter.
When you're declaring, it's a parameter. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, and this is basically just a variable which you can store a value in, but the scope is only limited to the function, meaning that if we use first name anywhere outside of the function, it's not going to work because it's not going to recognize it because it only exists in this little world. And that's it. Okay? So here are your parameters. And you call them with arguments.
Call them arguments.
With arguments.
Okay? Just like this little thing that we did over here, where we created this square function, where it basically just like it basically does a square of any number, right? Your parameter is your x, and then x is x times x. If I just do it just like this, it doesn't. What is it going to return? Nothing.
Yes.
What is x? Let's say that we want to square root 8. That's going to be our argument. Okay? Easy stuff. Parameter, argument. And they're both related. Okay? Like I can't not have a parameter and then be passing in an argument. That's going to be an error.
Makes sense. Parameters are mathematical parameters.
Yeah, you can think about it however you want, but just know the definition is that this is basically what it is. Because in like interview questions, man, they like test you for that. You know, like if you don't understand like the basic vocab of like what everything is, you know, then when you run into like, you know, a lot of like high level structures you're dealing with and giant objects and you just don't know where to start, where to finish. If you don't know where the parameters are and where the arguments are and what they're doing, then you're just going to be completely lost. And the other thing that I mentioned was what?
Property and methods.
Yeah, property methods. So basically properties are just basically built-in properties that you can do different stuff to your code with. A method, you can do the same thing with a method, except it's a predefined function that already exists inside an object somewhere in JavaScript.
Yeah.
Okay? Okay. Now, a little note to yourself, because we're going to be learning about two other types of loops, is that the question is, well, what kind of, you know, like a loop do I want to use in what situation? You know, it's honestly general preference. It's not black and white. However, use a for loop when you know how many times it's going to run. So like if you already know how many iterations you're going to have, because that's one of the conditions, right?
Yes.
Now a while loop you would use when you don't know how many times it's going to run, or whether it's unclear how many times it can run. So with that being said, let's move on to while loops. Okay, and let's talk about while loops for a little bit. So we'll take some notes up top over here. Now in while loops, what we do is that we set the variables outside the loop, as opposed to a for loop where it went inside. So basically the syntax would look something like this. So like while whatever your condition is, and then the code's going to go inside the curly braces. And then basically inside the loop we do what we want to, such as console logging or incrementing. So let's see that in action. So let's just start with a while loop. We're going to declare a variable first. We'll say let I equals 0. And then I'm going to do while, and then my condition is going to go here. We're going to do the exact same thing. So as long as I is less than 10, and then whatever you want to do goes in here. So we're going to do console.log, say while loop plus I. Now if I run this, What?
Yeah, the parenthesis.
Oh my God, look at
Let
that.
I
It's
equal to 0.
look at this. How many times it's running?
Oh my.
It's crazy.
We have already mentioned declared.
Exactly. Thank you. I was hoping somebody would say something.
Right.
Yeah, because we didn't increment it. So, okay, so we do that in the next line just by itself, okay? So if I save it now, oh my God, this is going crazy. Look, it's like refreshing like crazy. Did it freeze on me? Yeah, it did. Oh my God, I crashed the browser. Dope. All right. All right, there we go. Yeah, I've done that a couple times before. It like gets stuck and you're
Just
like, what the
fun.
hell? Yeah, just for fun. Yeah, so like what's more fun is that when you run a function inside the same function that doesn't return anything, so it gets stuck in a loop and it just keeps going and going and going, and then I've actually crashed somebody's computer doing that, which was great. So yeah, like if you want to mess with somebody, like you create a website and then you just like, create a button, be like, click over here and win $1 million or something. And then like you just put a loop in there
Yes.
that just like repeats itself, and then like their computer RAM memory just goes crazy because the browser is just trying to render it over and over and over, and then the computer just crashes. Yeah, that's a good thing to do if you know how to mess with JavaScript. Yeah. So as we can see, this actually works very, very similar to a for loop. Now let's talk about do-while loops. Again, I hope these notes help you because you need to go back and look at them because there are clear differences between them, and your interviewers will ask, be like, what's the difference between a for or a while loop? When would you use it? When would you use the other? So again, why would we use a for loop?
To
When we know how many specific iterations we need to make. Okay? A while loop, generally, you want to use when you're not sure of how many iterations it is that you want to make. Okay? But they both pretty much work the same way. That's just the general rule. If somebody was to ask you, you would say, well, they both work the same way, and it depends on the situation.
Yeah.
What is that situation? Do I know how many iterations do I need to run? If I know, if I have a hard count of how many iterations I need to run, I would definitely use a for loop. If I'm unclear, I will stick with a while loop. So what makes this different? It actually is a bit different because it's always going to run at least once, no matter what. And I'll show you what that means. So do while. Okay, so we'll declare a variable. Let's say let e equals 0. Then I'm going to say do, open up my curly braces, and I'm going to say console.log, say do while loop plus e. And I would use I'm just using e because I don't want to mess up the console over here, just so you guys can see. Make this up a little bit more. Okay. And then also I want to increment it, right? So I'll do e++. Then I'm going to come down to the next line. And then I'm going to say while. Let's say we wanted to go up to 12. So as long as e is less than 12. Actually, let's just do 10. Sorry. So if I save this, it'll print the do while loop. Okay. So what's different about this? Is basically that the do part with the curly braces is always going to run no matter what. Okay. And by no matter what, I mean that even if the condition while isn't met, it's still going to run. Okay. So let's do another example actually. So like if I do let f equals 100, let's say, and I do console.log, let's do while example 2 plus f plus plus. So while f is less than 10. Okay. Now over here we put 0, and it ran from 0 to 10. Now 100 is obviously less than 100, right? 10, right? So we're saying while f is less than 10, but over here we're declaring 100. So again, the point that it's going to run at least once. If I save this, it'll just do while example to 100. So it ran at least once at whatever value we defined it as. So even though we said f was less than 100, and this condition isn't true, right? It still ran it. It still ran it. Okay, so that's what I meant by it'll run at least once, no matter what. So it might not give you all the iterations, but it'll just be like, hey, dude, 100 is not less than 10, so here's your 100 back at you. Okay? Basically, that's what do while does. Works the same way as while loops, except it runs at least once. So even if your condition isn't met, it'll just spit that right back at you.
While does that too?
No. While is not going to do that.
So what's that going to do if it does that?
It didn't even run it. Because see, remember we over here we said it'll run at least once, even if the condition isn't true. Over here the condition isn't true. It didn't meet to begin with, so it's just like, screw it, I'm not running it. Right? But now if I change this back to 0, and again, this is while loops, right? So we're consoling while loop. I don't see a while in here. Now if I put it to 0 and if I save it, look at that, my while loops are back. Okay? Now, let's talk about looping through arrays. Okay? And there's two methods that are used. Again, I use the word method. So what is a method?
Predefined function.
Usually lives inside an object, right?
Yes.
Okay. So there's a method called for each. And there's another method called map. Okay? We use these two methods to loop through arrays, or to iterate through them. Okay?
Oh.
Basically, the for each method takes in a callback function, or also an anonymous function. Do you guys remember that? We talked about anonymous functions. They're basically functions without a name. Usually, it's like stuck to a variable, and then we just call the variable, right?
Yes.
So that's what an anonymous or a callback function is. And it can accept up to 3 parameters. And we'll talk about those parameters. So the first one is going to be the iterator. The naming convention for this is singular syntax, and I'll show you once we actually do it. Naming convention is similar to the name or syntax of the array that we're going to be working with. The second one is going to be the actual index. So it'll actually like return like the index number of whatever value that we're looping through inside that array. And then the third one is going to be the actual entire array. Okay. Now, if we wanted to, we could just use the first parameter, but we're just going to do all 3 just so you can see all 3 of them. Okay. So let's actually do that first before we get to maps. So let's create a new section. We'll call this iterating looping through array. And the first one we'll talk about is the for each method. Okay. So let's say that, first of all, before I even start the for each method, let's create our arrays first. So we'll say const, let's call them cars. And then for our arrays, it's the flat brackets, right?
Yes.
And then we'll just do like the models, I guess. So we'll start with Ford, Nissan, I don't know, Honda, and Toyota. Okay. Now if we wanted to loop through this without using the for each method first, so let's do for let I equal 0, semicolon. As long as I is less than the length of all the cars, so we'll do cars.length. Right, so we already know that the length of this is 3, right?
Yes.
But let's say that we have a giant array. Do you have the time to like go through every single one and count them? No, you just do cars.length, right? And then we want to increment I++. So in here, let's do console.log I. Now if I say this, all it's going to do is just return the index numbers, right? But we want to actually get the value. So how would we do that?
Cars, in that you can print a flower. Cars, flat brackets, I.
You're absolutely right. So if I just put it in brackets like this, and actually, no, hang on. What we would have to do is do cars, and then flat brackets, I. Now if we do it, it'll actually print out the text nodes, okay? With that being said, let's use the for each method, okay? So we do cars, for each, okay? We'll do function, okay? Now in here we can have 3 parameters, okay? So the first one is going to be basically, what do we talk about? The first one is the iterator. So the naming convention we said is similar to the name of the syntax, except it's just going to be in singular. So our variable over here was cars. We'll just call this car. So that's our first parameter. Then the second one was the index. So we'll just say index. And again, you can call it whatever you want. And then the third one was the entire array, right? So I'll just call it the entire gosh darn array. Okay, just to kind of show you that I can call it whatever I want. It's just the first one is going to return the actual iterator, the second one is going to be the index, and then the third one returns the entire array. Okay, so I'm going to come down, and then I'm going to console these one by one. So let's do console.log, and I'll say for each plus car. Okay, so if I save that, you'll see that it's returning the actual value of the cars. Okay, and I only put for each in there because I want you guys to actually see what method I'm using. Okay. Next we can console.log, and trying to think. I think I'll just use backticks this time. So we'll say with index, and then say index, semicolon, and I'll say car as well. The reason I'm doing that is because it'll spit it out like this. So we'll see for each car, for each Ford with index, and then it gives me the index number, and then the name of the thing. So let me actually just comment this out. Okay. See what it's doing over here? In this console, we're targeting the index parameter and also the car parameter. So it's returning it to us. So with index, it's looping through all of them. And then it's giving us not only the index number, but also the actual name of the car. You guys get it, right?
Sort of.
Right? Do you see what's happening?
Yes.
So basically the for each function is allowing us to use the parameters to actually loop through an array. Okay? And it's returning us the values. Okay? So over here, as we said, remember the second parameter returns us the index. So we're using that in this console. So it's giving us the index, and then it's also giving us the name of the cars. Okay, and then if we also console.log the entire gosh darn array. Okay, and remember we talked about the third one, right? The third parameter returns us the entire array. So if I just console.log, look, it's just going to return us the entire array. And then it'll obviously loop through each and every time because there are 4 objects in here. Not objects, 4 values in here.
Oh,
Okay?
so it goes every time.
Exactly, it's just
Okay.
looping it each time. Okay? So we'll just uncomment that.
So iteration is doing based on the index value. What if we want to change it? If we want to print only 3 times the entire array, does this function work?
I don't understand what you're trying to do.
So iteration is done based on the index number, right?
Yeah, it's based on however many items are in there. Yeah.
What if we want to print only 2 or 3 times? Does that help?
What if
This
you
one.
wanted to print only 2 or 3 times?
Yeah,
Print what 2 or 3 times?
the entire array. Like how is it printing like 4 times based
Uh-huh.
on the index number?
Yeah.
What if we want to print only 2 or 3 times? So can we change the index to a
Yeah,
number
do you-
and then you can do it?
Yeah, do you remember the if statement that we did?
Yes.
Where we did if, like whatever the variable is equals whatever that, then you can basically set it to however many times you
Oh.
want. And that's going to take a while. I don't want to go into it, but yes, there is a way of doing it. So if you just go back and look at the functions or the loops where we actually did it, using this where we can break out or like skip an iteration. So what you can do is you can just do break after like a certain number of times you want it to hit, and then it'll just stop after that. Okay? Again, same thing. So let's talk about map now, the map method. And basically what it does is it's used to return something different or a different array. When you start working with Node.js, you're going to be using map a lot.
What do you mean by Node.js?
Node.js is a runtime environment for JavaScript developers where you can actually run JavaScript in the back end. JavaScript is not designed to be run in the back end, but with Node.js you can.
Oh, okay.
So, and like that's why that's actually one reason why it's just a great time for JavaScript developers right now, because JavaScript only used to work on the front end. So if you wanted to be a back-end developer, you had to learn another language like PHP or Python or Java or something. Well, now you don't, because now you have Node.js, which basically runs on the same JavaScript engine that the Chrome browser runs on. So it basically like runs all your code server side. Yeah. So now you can be a full stack developer just knowing JavaScript. You don't have to learn another backend
Oh,
language.
nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking.
So yeah, like once you learn the basic foundations of JavaScript, you can actually learn Node really, really easily. As long as you understand it. That's the whole point. So let's look at maps. This is the map method. Okay, so let's start out with a variable. We'll say const users. And I'm going to create an array. And then inside the array, I'm going to have an object. So let's say I have an object with an ID of 1. So that's a key value pair of ID and 1. And then I have a name. Say Rick. Okay. Then I'm going to come and repeat this a few times. So we'll change these IDs. We'll change this to 2, we'll change 3, 4, 5, 6. And then Rick, sick, tick. Okay. Now what we'll do is I will create another variable called IDs. And we want to take the users array of objects and create an array of the IDs for the users. Okay, if you guys understand where I'm going with this. So let's do users.map. We'll create a function inside and give it a parameter of user. And then we'll say return user.id. We'll just make a note over here. Create another variable called IDs, which is what we did down there. And take the users array, which is right over here. This is an array, right? Users array. And create an array of the IDs for the users. So basically what we're doing is that we're kind of, I guess you can say, split this up. So this is an array that has a bunch of objects, and we're literally just splitting it up, like we're breaking it open, and then we're taking the IDs out and creating another array with it. Okay? So here you have it. We're creating a new variable called IDs, and we're saying, hey, take this users array and map it. And what are we doing to map it? Is that we're basically grabbing the ID from the user, okay? So now, if I console.log IDs,
I have a question.
save, yes.
User.id.
This is just a parameter. This is just a parameter.
Users.map.
Yeah. So this users, what it's saying is that, hey, I want to create a new ID, or I want to create a new variable called IDs, and in that variable, what I want it to happen is that go to this variable called users, okay, and then use the map method. Okay. Now, what does a map method do? It returns something different or a different array. Okay. So we're saying, hey, go into this array of objects, okay, and I just want the IDs. Okay, create a new array of IDs.
Oh. Okay.
That's all it's doing. This over here is just a parameter. I can just call this cool kids and put cool kids. Okay, doesn't matter because that's just a parameter that we're using. It's in place to basically fetch the IDs. Okay, and I can even give this different numbers. So if I change this to a whole bunch of other random numbers, okay, it doesn't matter. Now if I save, you'll see that it returns the actual IDs into a separate array with its own index numbers. That's basically just what map does. And I'm going to change this back to user because that's the syntax, the proper syntax you should be using. Okay, again, this is a singular of the multiples that we're working over here, so that somebody who's a knowledgeable, experienced JavaScript developer, and if they look at this, they'll be like, oh, okay, I see what he's doing here, is that he's actually using this users variable, and then he's stripping it down and just basically extracting the IDs and creating a new variable. That's it. Okay. Now this is how we iterate through arrays. Last but not least is iterating through objects using the for-in method. Or actually not for-in method. Did I say method? For-in loop. Okay. Again, just come back up here and leave a note for yourself. So we'll say looping through objects, and we're going to use for in, and it's used to loop, iterate through objects, so we can get key value pairs. Used to loop or iterate through objects so we can get key value pairs. You guys do know what key value pairs are, right? Yeah, that's what objects have, right? They have a key and a value.
Oh, okay.
Whereas an array just has a value. It doesn't have a key,
Okay.
right? Right? Like this object we created, this is an object.
Yes.
Your ID is your key,
Wow.
and this is your value. Okay? Whereas with an array, you just have values. There are no keys for it. I mean, there's an index for it. You can use it calling an index, but this actually has a specific value that I can, change. Okay? Or actually key that I can change. All right. So let's loop through this. So I'm going to create a user first. We'll call it const user. And equals open curly braces. I'm going to create a first name key. And what do you guys want to call this?
Anything.
Just when I was about to say that, you come up with fantastic names, you wrote Champa.
Okay, so we have a user here. First name is Champa, last name is Chameli. She is 89 years old and decent human being. We'll say false. She's not a decent human being. It's horrible. I don't need a semicolon there. All right. Just observe how the syntax of this looks. It's crazy, okay? So we'll just say for.
Age 89,
Okay, then we're going to do let x in user. Okay, now x right here is basically kind of like a parameter. Kind of. I mean, it works kind of like a parameter. X isn't defined anywhere. We'll just use it later as a parameter. Okay. So we're using for, in, and then user, obviously we're catching it from here.
Yeah.
Open parentheses, and then I'm just going to do console.log x. Okay. So what this is going to do, is that this is going to print all the keys. Okay. So it's printing us the first name, last name, age, decent human being. It's just printing us the keys. Okay. Now if we wanted to print all the values, let me comment this out. How would I do that?
User. X.
All the values?
X in what? Parentheses?
Yes.
User is not a function.
Right bracket.
X, right?
Yes.
Oh no, it's just an error on my part. I forgot the parentheses afterwards. Oh, look at that! Yay! Okay. Now, if we want to print both the key and the value pair, I'll just do console.log, and I love using template strings, so I'll just do that. $x, put in the colon, and then I'll put in my user. X, right. There you go. So basically, the for-in method lets us basically loop through an object. And then we can print out just the keys, we can print out just the values, or we can print the whole key pair value. Okay? That's loops. Guys, we just wrote 118 lines of code in just this one section, so awesome. Let's take a 5 to 10 minute, okay?
Yeah, sure. Definitely need it.
We're making great time, by the way. Okay, so let's talk about scope. So I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to create a new file. Let's say this is, what were we on? 16. So this is 16, and we'll say scope.js. Okay. So let's go into our index and let's add our script file for scope. So now that we know what if statements are, what loops are, and functions are, let's actually talk about scope when it comes to let and const versus var. This is something that I actually didn't want to go over before because we hadn't gone over functions yet, but now that we have, this would be a great time to touch this. So let's first create our global scope. Okay, so this is our global scope. And what do I mean by global scope?
Throughout the website?
Yeah, basically just something that's basically a piece of data that is sitting out there. You know, basically you can think of it as like the first tier that everything else can access. Okay, so it's just sitting out there, like it's basically like the parent, you know? Okay, so like if I had, what kind of an analogy should I use? Like basically, like let's say that if I have like a Russian doll, right? So like the biggest one that's sitting outside is basically the global scope, and then everything just basically inside it. So like you can create like, you know, like a relationship where you have like parents and children or siblings.
Yep.
You know, and then those relationships, they vary. So like something that's inside of something can in some cases be accessed by something in the global scope of it or not, you know, depending on what kind of a variable you're using. So again, we're talking about let and const versus var and how they're different to each other. That's actually one reason why let and const are amazing, because it actually solves a lot of the problems that we had when we were working with global scopes and child scopes, and we were just limited to just var, you know? You'd run into a lot of errors, and we'd have to like do a lot of like stuff to go around the problem, and then just make your website much more, what's the word, the opposite of robust, because the more lines of code you had, the longer it's going to take for, you know, like your code to be processed. Yeah. So basically let and const actually helps us out with that. So in our global scope, let's create one of each. So we'll do var a equals 1. Then we'll do let b equals 2. And then we'll do const c equals 3. Okay? And then we'll do an output on the bottom over here. And we'll say this is the global scope output. Okay, so we'll do console.log, say global scope. We'll do A, B, C. So if I save it now, we'll see global scope A equals 1, 2 equals, or actually B equals 2, and C equals 3, right?
Yes.
So it's spitting all that out. All right. Now, let's do function scope. Okay, so we have a global scope and we have a function scope. And we talked about function scope when we were going over functions, right? Basically, whatever variables that we declare inside is right is only relevant. Okay, well let's see something. Let's create a function. And we'll call it test. No parameters needed. Let's create some variables in here. So let's create var a equals, we'll call this 5. Okay? Come down, we'll do the same thing. Let b equals, actually here, let's call this 4. my bad. B is going to equal 5, and we'll do const C again, and this time it's going to equal 6. Okay. Now inside of here, I'm going to do console.log function scope A, B, C. Save. It's not going to work because we haven't called our test yet, so we have to call our function. And then now if I save it, you'll see that I'm getting function scope 4, 5, and 6. So everything good so far, right?
Yes.
For example, like you remember when we talked about const and we said once we declared we can't like change the value to anything else? Well, that only affects it in the global scope. When we're inside the function scope, this is a completely different scope altogether,
Yes.
and then we can create new functions inside it, so it doesn't affect it, okay? I mean, that would be the only one we would worry about, the const, right? Because the var and let, we can change the values later on. But as you can see, const over here is working fine. So it's inside the global scope. It's not affected by this. If we step outside of the global scope, and if we do const C equals, let's say this time 30, I'm going to get an error because it will say C has already been declared in the global scope. See that?
Yes.
Okay. You can leave that in your notes if you want. I'm just going to get rid of it. Okay. Now there's also block level scope. Okay. And basically, block level scope relates to, or it's for if statements, loops, and pretty much anything wrapped inside curly braces. Okay, so let's look at if statements. So if we say if true, and we'll put that in here, we'll set the condition to true so we know it definitely runs for sure. If I come down here and if I say var a equals this time 7, let b equals 8, and const c equals 9, and then if we console.log, it's got to be in parentheses, block scope A, B, C. Okay, save. Okay, now if you observe over here, the block level scope looks fine, 7, 8, 9, right? The function scope also looks fine, 4, 5, 6. But if we go back and if we look at our global scope, you'll see that our var a has changed. See that it's no longer 1. It has changed to 7. Okay? So let and const are still 2 and 3, but the variable a has been changed to 7. So the way let and const works is basically how most programming languages work. Var is kind of weird, and one of the things that many developers didn't like about the older JavaScript, it would cause security risk and can cause a lot of confusion if you have a variable in the global scope, then inside a block there's a similar variable. So the general rule to keep in mind is that var declared inside a block level scope alters var in the global scope. Okay, and basically all this is to just basically demonstrate this point. Okay, so for example, if we do another for loop, for example, let's do a for loop in a block level scope. So if we do for let a equals 0, and then we'll do a is less than 10 and a plus plus. Come back over here, we'll do console.log. Let's do template strings. We'll say block level for, or block level scope for loop with let, and then we'll say $sign. Let's put A in here. So now it's basically doing, so because we used let in here, our var A in the global scope was not affected by it. So again, because this isn't var, it's not affected by it. Just like let and const weren't affected in the global scope, or actually in the block level scope because of what we had in the global. Okay, same concept. But however, if we actually use var, so if I just so let me bring this down, and if I use var this time, if we do it now, you'll see that it'll change the value in the global scope as well. Okay, so basically same thing. So like if we ever use var in the block level scope, okay, declared inside the block level scope is going to alter how it looks in the global scope. Okay, so after running this, we set the var is saying, hey, as long as it starts at 0 and it can go up to 10, then basically what it does is that it declares your variable to 10, even though we had one over here. Okay. Yeah, so let and const have a global block level scope, whereas var has a function scope. That's basically all you need to know. So let me actually write those down. Yeah, we already wrote this down. So we'll say let and const have a block level scope, and var has a function scope. Does that make sense, you guys? Yeah, I mean, right, like it makes sense because you're seeing it happen. When you see it happen, you're like, oh, but then it's just one of those things, right? If you don't apply it, it'll just go over your head. So again, like the need to go over your notes just so you can retain that information.
Can you just go down?
Yes, no problem. Yeah, see the function scope always stays the same because whatever's inside the function is just going to stay here. Like nothing outside it can affect it. Anything inside here won't affect what we got out there. But once we're working with block level scope, that's where var becomes a little iffy, okay? So if you have a variable that's declared inside a block level scope, it'll change the value of it in the global scope. That's the problem. Okay, so that's where let and const come in, because you see over here we had let b equals 8, c equals 9. In the block level, it stayed the same. Okay, like even the const, right? Like it didn't give us an error. Cool?